So we're going to start by just going over a little bit about what inquiry is. First thing that we're going to kind of talk about is we're kind of thinking about how to differentiate, I guess, like traditional, like classroom research, and then also talking about the kinds of research we might typically do on our own, and then also the kind of research that we're going to do, which is inquiry. And inquiry is a little bit different. We're going to start just with like a research paper like you might write for class. So typically first you pick your topic, right? You might even write your thesis statement first so that you have a focus. Then you know what your thesis statement is. You know you want what the paper's supposed to like show or talk about. So then you go and you find sources that fit that. Then you read the sources. Maybe. Most likely you're doing something, especially if the paper is like due tomorrow, you're doing something that I call quote mining, where you actually, like, you're just looking through the source, looking for like the good quotes and the good statistics that like back up what you're saying and make you look right. And if you're doing the 5-paragraph essay, which you may be kind of using that go-to formula, or you already have your outline, you're just kind of like plugging the stuff that you're like skimming for into your paper, and then you just sort of write a paper around that, I guess. And a lot of people have, you go through this method. It's a pretty popular way to do it for a class, because you've got, like, you have an assignment and you have a couple of days to do it. You had a couple weeks to do it and you're starting at the last minute, or maybe you were just assigned that paper. And I think that's what a lot of us run into, especially for classroom research, is it's typically different than the way you might think of research happening anywhere else. Again, back to that like simulated experience, like you have a deadline. So a lot of times going out and doing a lot of research, or the level of research you might expect like an expert to do, or someone who's going to write something to get it published, you might not have that kind of time. And if you're not already an expert on the subject, that makes another issue, because there's really not time to go out and like become an expert or read what you need to be well versed on the issue. The problem with that is that there really wasn't anything learned, I guess, like not just about the issue itself, but really about like research skills. Like every time you sit down to do real research, you should figure out something new. Like there's so many levels and so much depth to doing good research. And it's really difficult to push those skills if you're always in a rush and using like go-to things and you never try anything new. You're also getting, honestly, like biased research. If you're starting with a thesis statement, you're starting with the point you want the paper to make, and then you're invested in having that research back up that point regardless. And that is the definition of being biased. Especially if you're skimming through, you're kind of looking for things that just support what you have to say. You're not really hearing everybody out. You're not getting a well-rounded set of data. And that's kind of bias with a big B. I kind of think about it as like bias with a big B versus a little b. Like bias with a little b is the kind of bias that like everybody has and is kind of in everything. Like when you read everything, like anything you read, the writer has their own like little like values and quirks and preferences that influence that writing, right? Like the little b bias. Big B bias is usually like typically on purpose. It could be like in a class setting, you can be biased in like these kinds of papers without knowing that you're being biased. But like an organization that's trying to, get you to support their company, and only, shows data for, their own company, or only shows a certain set of data that, is going to influence you to support them, even if like there's other data out there. That's bias. A news station that only reports, news a certain way. We've never seen that happen, right, guys? That's bias with a big B. So you want to stay away from bias with a big B. And when you're starting with that thesis statement and you're invested in it, or you're starting with that opinion and you're invested in it and you're not open, that's bias. So it also gives you kind of a shallow understanding of the issue. Because you just don't have time. Like your paper's due in a couple hours. You just don't have the time to invest in really learning very much about the issue. Which really sucks because it does like undercut the point of doing it in the first place. And you really just end up reporting what others are saying. We talked about the goal, especially in academic research, especially once you get into like college and beyond. The goal is no longer just to report back what other people are saying. It's to really be analytical and critical and thinking and contributing and pushing the conversation forward. And you can't push the conversation forward if you haven't heard what's already existing in the whole conversation. So inquiry is a little bit different because the goal isn't just to hunt for black and white answers or like find stuff that supports a thesis statement. And it does let you do a little bit of risk taking. You start with the way scholars do it. Like they have an interest, and it kind of gets into the next one. It's led by their own curiosity, and they take risks. Like they start with a question or a goal. They might have a hypothesis, and they leave some wiggle room for that to change because you don't know what research you're really gonna find. Like you may have to make adjustments in the process and take some risks. And when you're doing something like this, you have to kind of recognize that there's always something more you can know because again, like the unending conversation and things continue to keep going. People continue, there's new events and new studies, and people continue to add their own thoughts and concerns. New laws come out. It's always moving. And there's room for multiple answers and multiple perspectives. A lot of times, you'll find that even where there's different perspectives, there's almost always like shared concerns and multiple ways to go about something. So it leaves room to explore everything in the conversation, all the concerns, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. And be able to analyze and criticize and evaluate what is good, what is bad, what is ugly. And to do some genuine research, to go to a lot of different places and gather a lot of information and get new questions and push that being able to ask critical questions, which is again like one of those skills involved in critical reading. So when we're thinking about why do this instead, for a lot of reasons. First, you establish and get and practice like processes and methods that are closer to like real world research rather than the traditional classroom research, which you've probably done a lot of and will probably have to do in the future. But it lets you do that active investigation yourself of being led by questions rather than a thesis statement, led by curiosity and trying to problem solve and look at a complex issue without a single right answer and be able to weigh some things and have time to do that and have more complex learning outcomes. And especially like personal responsibility for, it's your project, it's your research. And also having independent inquiry and research habits that are transferable to someplace outside of the classroom. And to also have some opportunities to really understand something about the issue and about the whole conversation, to really have the time to do that, to, learn something. And be able to evaluate and compare different sources and opinions with less bias because we're, again, like in less of a rush, like rather than like just cherry picking to get that through information to get that one-sided argument, going to www.imright.com. So what you get there is, that incomplete and that cursory look at the issue. So, keep in mind, I would say this a lot, and I am, you can't refute what you didn't read. So you have to read everything. All right, so everybody, I would wager everybody has actually done some real inquiry in your own life, because you get on the Google and you type stuff in and you look stuff up And real inquiry and research looks a little bit more like this. You think some, you read some, you ask a new question, you find a new source, and then you maybe find some more sources and ask some new questions and talk about some things and adjust your question. Have you ever been on the internet like maybe like, I don't know, 11 p.m.? Because that's when, it happens the most. And you're on like social media and you notice someone shared like an article or shared, an event, something, and you're like, oh, I didn't know that happened. It's interesting. You click on it because clickbait. And you're reading through it and you're like, oh, I didn't know that happened. You click on something because, there's like hyperlinked everything to get you into, all these like, all this spider webbing. So you go to a new place and you're reading, you're like, oh, I didn't know that. And you click on it, you go somewhere else, and you end up at Wikipedia because all internet roads lead to Wikipedia eventually. And then you're like reading through it, and all of a sudden it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're reading a Wikipedia page about vampires, and you're not sure how you got here. Maybe that's never happened to you. It happens to me all the time. And that's actually a little more like real research because you're following questions, going to a new place and asking a new question, and you're following your curiosity rather than just trying to support a point. And how this kind of fits together, I want you to think about, it's easy to forget the skills that we said we were going to work on this semester, the rhetorical knowledge, knowledge of conventions, composing processes, critical reading, critical reflection, our big umbrella writing and research skills. I want you to think about the inquiry project and some of the other work we do as the platform we're going to use to work on these skills. So it's kind of how they're related. The inquiry project is a tool, and the focus is the skills and what it is allowing us to practice.